When I saw my late brother's signature on a deed selling my farmland, I knew something was wrong. He had been dead for 6 months. And the ones holding that deed were my own daughter and her husband. They thought they had forged their way into my inheritance, but what I did next made them wish they had never learned how to spell my name. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Whitmore. I am 71 years old, a widower, and a grandfather of 3. My life has been nothing glamorous, just 50 years of farming the same Missouri soil my father left me. That land is my heart, every acre watered with sweat, calluses, and memories of raising my children. I was born in that farmhouse, in a room where the plaster still shows faint cracks my father patched when money was tight. I grew up feeding chickens before school, learning how to mend fences before I ever learned algebra, and listening to my mother hum hymns as she hung laundry on the line. My childhood wasn't filled with luxuries, but it was rich in the ways that mattered: Sunday suppers with cornbread and roast, laughter echoing off the kitchen walls, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken aloud because it's in every gesture. When I turned 18, I didn't go off chasing some big city dream. I stayed, because the land needed me, and because my parents were aging. Some men measure success by the corner office or the size of their bank account. Mine has always been measured by bushels of corn, calves born strong in spring, and the look of satisfaction on a neighbor's face when I handed over produce they knew came from honest work. I met Eleanor at a church picnic in 1973. She wore a yellow dress that the summer breeze kept tugging at, and I swear I fell in love before she even said hello. We married within the year and built our lives around the farm. She was the kind of woman who could make a house smell like heaven with nothing more than biscuits and gravy, and the kind of mother who knew how to patch scraped knees with equal parts peroxide and tenderness. Together, we raised Diane. She was our only child, our miracle. We poured everything into her, every hope, every ounce of love. I taught her how to ride a bike down the gravel drive, how to bait a hook at the pond, how to tell when the hay was dry enough to bale. Eleanor, God rest her soul, taught her compassion and grace. For years, Diane was the light of our lives, and when she gave me grandchildren, it was as if my world doubled in brightness. After Eleanor passed, the farm became my anchor. Grief is a heavy thing, but planting rows of soybeans, mending fences, and fixing tractors gave me purpose. And when my brother died, leaving me his 40 acres, I thought it was fate's way of telling me to keep building, keep holding the family legacy together. That land had been in Whitmore hands for nearly a century, and now it was mine to protect. I thought it was a blessing. My daughter, Diane, thought it was her payday. Diane was the apple of my eye from the moment I first held her in the delivery room. She came out hollering like she already had something to prove to the world, and I remember whispering into her tiny ear, "You'll never go without, little girl. Not a day in your life." And I meant it. Her childhood was full of the simple joys I had always wanted her to have. I built her a treehouse with my own hands, planks of pine nailed together on a sturdy oak behind the barn. She'd spend hours up there with her dolls, calling it her castle. Every winter, I'd hitch up the old tractor to a sled and pull her laughing through the snow until my bones ached. Every summer, I took her to the county fair, bought her candied apples, and cheered louder than anyone when she won the baking contest with Eleanor's pie recipe. But even back then, I saw flashes of something I didn't know how to name. A hunger, maybe. A knack for finding the shortcut instead of the hard way. When she was 12, I gave her $5 at the fair. Instead of buying cotton candy like the other kids, she wandered over to the ring toss booth. 10 minutes later, she came back with a stuffed bear twice her size and $50 she'd won back from some teenage boy. She smiled sweetly, but I noticed the boy's red ears and embarrassed shuffle. It didn't sit right with me. When she turned 16, she begged for a car. I was ready to get her an old pickup, something reliable. But she cried and wheedled until Eleanor convinced me to stretch the budget for a shiny used convertible. Diane loved the attention it brought, and though I wanted to believe it was just teenage pride, there were nights I caught her sneaking out to joyride with friends who never seemed to bring her home on time. Still, I told myself she'd grow out of it. After all, don't most children wander off the straight path before finding their way? Eleanor always said, "Harold, our Diane's got ambition. She'll use that sharp mind of hers for good one day." And I wanted to believe her. But the older Diane got, the sharper her edges became. She had a way of turning charm into currency, of bending people to her will with a smile that didn't always reach her eyes. In high school, I learned she had sold answers to a history test to her classmates. When I confronted her, she laughed and said, "Dad, I was just being resourceful." Resourceful, I repeated, though my chest ached with worry. At the time, I brushed it off as youthful mischief. I told myself she'd learn that life doesn't reward shortcuts. But deep down, I wondered if she already knew something about the world I didn't, that sometimes, the quickest hands take the most. Looking back, I realized those were the early signs. The foreshadowing I ignored because I loved her too much to imagine she'd ever turn that cunning against me. Back then, I saw Diane as a spark of fire in a gentle family. I didn't see how fire, if left unchecked, can burn down the house that shelters it. Diane met Trevor at a business seminar in Kansas City, or at least that's how she told the story. She came home that weekend glowing, talking about a man who understood her and thought big, just like she did. I first met him a month later, when she brought him out to the farm for Sunday dinner. He arrived in a polished suit, the kind that looked out of place in a dining room where the wallpaper still bore decades of family photos. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "it's an honor to finally meet you. Diane tells me you've built all this with your own two hands. Remarkable." I nodded, but something in his tone set my teeth on edge. He spoke like a salesman trying to flatter his way into a deal, not like a man genuinely impressed. During dinner, he asked me questions, lots of them. About the farm's size, about the value of the land, about what kind of inheritance I planned to leave Diane. He asked so smoothly that Diane didn't notice, laughing as she sipped her iced tea, but I noticed. "Trevor," I said finally, setting down my fork, "you sure seem interested in things that aren't yours." For a split second, his smile faltered. Then he chuckled, lifted his glass, and said, "Just curious, sir. I'm a numbers man by trade. Can't help myself. Numbers man." That was his phrase. Later, I learned he'd been a mid-level banker for a regional firm before being let go. He framed it as corporate downsizing, but I'd been around long enough to know when a man leaves under a cloud. Still, Diane was smitten. She insisted Trevor was ambitious, driven, and the kind of man who could give her the life she deserved. Eleanor had been gone by then, and I didn't have the heart to push Diane away from her happiness. But there were warning signs. Trevor never seemed to talk about his own family. He always arrived in flashy clothes but drove a beat-up car. He spoke with authority about investments but seemed vague when pressed for details. And above all, he encouraged Diane's taste for shortcuts. Where I had always preached hard work, Trevor promised leverage. Where I had warned Diane about debt, Trevor told her it was other people's money working for you. One night, after a few drinks, I overheard him say to Diane in the kitchen, "You've been patient with your dad long enough. He doesn't realize what he's sitting on. That farm is worth more than he even knows. Imagine what we could do if it was in our hands." They didn't know I was standing in the doorway, watching them in the dim light. Diane leaned against the counter, smiling at him like he was the answer to her prayers. That was the moment I realized Trevor wasn't just a man courting my daughter. He was a man circling my land, my life's work, like a wolf circling sheep. And Diane? She was letting him lead her closer to the flock. After Trevor came into the picture, Sunday dinners started to change. At first, they still came out to the farm every week. Diane would bring a pie from the bakery in town instead of making Eleanor's old recipes, but I didn't complain. I was just happy to see her, to see her children running through the same fields she had grown up in. But slowly, Trevor's presence turned those dinners into something else. He always had ideas, better ways to run the farm, modern strategies I should consider. He suggested leasing out parts of the land, investing the profits instead of wasting them on upkeep. Diane nodded along, eyes shining like he was Moses bringing down stone tablets. I'd sit there at the table, listening quietly, and then I'd say, "This farm has fed our family for 100 years. It's not wasted." Trevor would smile thinly, sip his wine, and change the subject. But I could see in his eyes, he thought I was a fool. Then the visits became less frequent. "Busy week, Dad," Diane would say on the phone. "We'll come next month." Or Trevor would call instead, his voice polite but clipped. "Diane's tied up with work. I'll make sure she calls you soon." Soon never came. The grandchildren stopped visiting as often, too. When they did, they seemed uncomfortable, like they'd been told not to talk too much about what their parents were planning. Evan, the oldest, always lingered, though. He'd help me fix the tractor or carry feed, and once, when Trevor wasn't around, he muttered, "Grandpa, just keep your eyes open." I didn't press him. But the words stuck with me. By then, I'd started noticing little oddities. Mail arriving late. Bank statements I never saw before. One afternoon, I drove into town to pay property taxes in person, only for the clerk to frown and say, "Mr. Whitmore, we already received your payment last week, from your daughter." I hadn't given Diane a cent. That was the first real crack in the facade. And a few weeks later, the whole wall crumbled. The call came on a Thursday morning. The county clerk again, her voice hesitant, almost apologetic. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you don't need to sign anything else regarding the property sale. The deed's already filed." I froze. "Sale? What sale?" She hesitated, then added softly, "The deed transferring your farmland, yours and your late brother's acreage, to Diane and Trevor. It went through last week. Congratulations." I hung up without answering. My hand shook as I reached for my truck keys, heart hammering harder than it had since Eleanor's funeral. At the courthouse, I demanded the file. And there it was, a notarized deed with my brother's name scrawled across the page, his signature, shaky and uneven, but familiar enough to pass to an untrained eye. Except my brother had been dead for 6 months. Beside it, in neat loops, was Diane's handwriting. And Trevor's. The notary stamp gleamed at the bottom. But I knew enough to see it was a forgery. The man whose name was on it had lost his license years ago. I stared at those papers until my vision blurred, until the black ink bled into the white page. They hadn't just isolated me. They had erased me. And for the first time in my life, I realized my own flesh and blood had crossed a line I couldn't forgive. The day after I saw the forged deed, I didn't sleep. I sat in Eleanor's old rocking chair by the window, the papers spread across the kitchen table, the clock ticking louder than it ever had in my life. Rage burned hot in my chest, but beneath it was something colder, heavier, sorrow. I could forgive a lot. But I couldn't forgive this. The next morning, Evan showed up. He'd driven in from the city without being asked, just to check on Grandpa. He was always sharper than the others, always watching. He found me at the table, my coffee cold. He glanced at the documents, then back at me. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "they went too far, didn't they?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He put a hand on my shoulder, strong and steady, and in that moment I realized something: this fight wasn't just mine. That weekend, I had the other 2 grandchildren over, little Amy and Samuel. Diane had dropped them off for a few hours, though it stretched late into the evening as usual. They didn't know anything about deeds or probate courts. All they knew was that Grandpa's farm was their playground, their safe place. We walked the rows of corn, Samuel riding on my shoulders, Amy holding my hand. They begged for stories about when their mom was little, about the treehouse, about how Eleanor used to sing while hanging laundry. I told those stories with a smile, even as my stomach nodded with the knowledge that their parents were trying to strip it all away from them. That night, as I tucked them in upstairs, Amy asked, "Grandpa, when we're older, can we live here too?" Her eyes were shining, hopeful, innocent. I felt my throat close, but I forced myself to smile. "Sweetheart, you'll always have a place here. Always." When I went back downstairs, I stood at the bottom of the staircase for a long time, staring at the walls lined with family photos. Generations of Whitmores looking back at me. My father. My brother. Eleanor. And now my grandchildren. I realized then that Diane and Trevor weren't just stealing from me. They were trying to erase a century of family history. And I wasn't going to let them. The next morning, I pulled out the old chest from the barn loft. Inside were every deed, every tax receipt, every scrap of paper tied to this land since 1928. Proof. The kind of proof Trevor and Diane couldn't forge. But I also had something else, Evan. He worked in digital forensics, and when I showed him the forged deed, he didn't just see betrayal. He saw evidence. He leaned over the paper, smirking bitterly. "They didn't even do a good job, Grandpa. The notary stamp. The guy lost his license 3 years ago. Anyone who looks close will see it's a fake." My heart pounded. For the first time in weeks, I felt not despair, but purpose. "Evan," I said, "can you prove it?" He grinned. "Better than that. I can bury them with their own lies." And so the plan began. Quiet. Careful. Just like planting a crop, prepare the ground, sow the seeds, wait for the harvest. This time, though, the harvest wouldn't be corn or soybeans. It would be justice. In the days that followed, I lived 2 lives. On the surface, I played the same role I always had, the quiet old man, thankful for his daughter's visits, patient with Trevor's smirking advice. When they came by with the grandchildren, I smiled and listened, nodding like I hadn't seen the knife they'd already buried in my back. But underneath, I was awake in a way I hadn't been for years. Every word they spoke, every glance they shared, I weighed and measured like I was inspecting a crop for signs of rot. And the more I watched, the clearer it became. Diane had convinced herself she was entitled to what she was stealing, and Trevor had convinced her I was too old to stop them. At night, when the house was silent and the crickets sang outside, I'd sit at the kitchen table with the forged deed in one hand and a photo of Eleanor in the other. I'd trace her smile with my thumb and whisper, "Don't worry, love. I'll take care of it." It wasn't just anger that kept me awake, it was grief. Not just for the land, but for Diane. The little girl who once held my hand at the fair, who used to beg me for one more story before bed, had grown into a woman I barely recognized. Somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing me as her father and started seeing me as an obstacle. That realization cut deeper than any fraud ever could. But when I looked at Amy and Samuel racing through the fields, or saw Evan's steady eyes watching me, I remembered who I was fighting for. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about protecting the only good part of Diane that was left, her children. So I let Diane and Trevor believe they'd won. I let them sit at my table, eat my food, laugh about future plans that didn't include me. And while they were busy plotting their empire, I was planting something else, patience, proof, and the kind of quiet fury they mistook for weakness. Evan was my right hand. He'd come over with his laptop, papers spread across the dining table, muttering as he compared signatures and cross-checked dates. I'd watch him work, pride and sadness twisting inside me. Pride that he had inherited Eleanor's sharp mind, sadness that Diane had thrown away the same gift. One evening, as we sat surrounded by papers, Evan looked up at me and said, "You know, Grandpa, we could take this to the sheriff right now. Get it over with." I shook my head. "Not yet. They need to feel safe first. They need to believe I don't suspect a thing. Otherwise, they'll wriggle out of it. He frowned. So we wait. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the worn wood grain of the table I'd eaten on for 40 years. A farmer knows better than anyone, you can't rush a harvest. You plant the seed, you tend the ground, and when the time's right, you take it all in one clean sweep. That's what this was going to be, a harvest of betrayal. A reckoning. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, I felt alive again. Not because I wanted revenge for myself, but because I knew I was fighting for something bigger, for my family's future, for the land that had carried us through generations, for the grandchildren who deserved to inherit more than ashes and lies. The night I rewrote my will was the loneliest and clearest night of my life. The papers lay spread out on Eleanor's old writing desk, the one she used to balance the farm accounts on. The lamp's yellow glow softened the room, but it couldn't soften the weight of what I was doing. Every page was a reckoning. Every signature a severed tie. I stared at the blank line where Diane's name should have been. My hand shook as I held the pen, not from age but from sorrow. I remembered her as a girl, running through the fields with her hair flying behind her, shouting, "Daddy, look at me." And here I was, erasing her from the family legacy she was meant to carry. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to write. The silence pressed down on me, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I imagined Eleanor's voice, soft but firm, "Do what you have to, Harold. Protect what matters." So I wrote. Everything, the farmhouse, the fields, the adjoining acres my brother had left me, the tractors, the savings account, even the cedar chest of family keepsakes, went to my grandchildren. Split evenly among them, with Evan as executor. Not a cent, not a square foot, not a family heirloom for Diane or Trevor. I paused after signing the last page, my eyes burning. "I'm sorry, baby girl," I whispered into the quiet. "But you made your choice. And now I've made mine." When I sealed the envelope, I didn't feel anger. I felt relief. The will wasn't revenge, it was protection. A wall of ink and paper to make sure Diane and Trevor could never poison the family legacy again. It was the one gift I could still give Eleanor, wherever she was, the promise that the farm would outlive the ones who tried to corrupt it. As I slid the papers into the safe, I felt something shift inside me. For weeks I'd carried grief like a stone in my chest. But now there was something else, something harder and steadier, resolve. The will was finished. The land was safe. Now, all that was left was to let Diane and Trevor walk themselves right into the trap they had built. The next Sunday, I set the table like Eleanor used to. I laid out the good china with the faded blue trim, polished the silver until it caught the afternoon light, and placed a vase of fresh-cut daisies in the center. I even pulled out the linen napkins, the ones we used only for holidays. It wasn't just dinner, it was theater. When Diane and Trevor arrived, the grandchildren ran ahead of them, filling the house with the kind of noise that always made my chest ache with love. Amy clutched a drawing she'd made, a crooked picture of the farmhouse with the words Grandpa's home written in purple crayon. Samuel tugged at my sleeve, begging me to come see the fort he'd built out of hay bales in the barn. I hugged them both tight, holding on just a second longer than usual. Behind them came Diane, dressed in a tailored blouse and heels that clicked on the hardwood floors. She carried herself like she was already queen of the estate. Trevor followed, in his usual sport coat and cologne strong enough to choke a mule. He gave me a smile that didn't touch his eyes and clapped me on the shoulder like he was greeting a business partner. "Dad, the table looks beautiful," Diane said, surveying the spread. "You really didn't need to go to all this trouble." "I wanted tonight to be special," I replied, keeping my voice warm and steady. "Family dinners matter." We gathered around the table. The food was simple, roast chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, but I'd made it with care. As we ate, the children laughed, telling me stories from school, while Diane and Trevor leaned into each other, whispering and smirking as though they were already sitting in my seat at the head of the table. Halfway through dinner, Trevor raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "The Whitmore legacy is about to enter a new chapter." Diane touched his arm, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Dad, you'll see. Once everything is settled, we're going to take such good care of the land. You won't have to worry about a thing." I kept my fork moving slowly, as if her words hadn't sliced through me. "Is that so?" Trevor leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Absolutely. We've already been discussing opportunities. Leasing sections for development, maybe even selling a portion to a solar company. The possibilities are endless once we bring the property into modern hands." "Modern hands," I repeated softly, swirling the gravy on my plate. "Yes," Diane said quickly, glancing at Trevor as if to encourage him. "You've worked hard your whole life, Dad. Isn't it time you let someone else take over?" The children had gone quiet. Amy's fork hovered over her plate, her big eyes darting between her mother and me. Evan, sitting at the far end of the table, cleared his throat but said nothing. His gaze met mine for a fraction of a second, steady and knowing. I set my fork down carefully, folded my napkin, and smiled. "You're right. I am tired. Sometimes I think about how nice it would be to let someone else handle things." Trevor's smile widened, and Diane's shoulders relaxed. "They thought they had me. But," I added, reaching for my water glass, "tired or not, this land doesn't belong to ambition. It belongs to family." There was a flicker in Trevor's eyes, annoyance, quickly masked by charm. "Of course, Harold. That's all we mean. We are family." I let the silence stretch, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall filling the room. Then I raised my glass. "To endings," I said quietly. Diane frowned. "What do you mean?" I just smiled, the kind of slow, steady smile people mistake for weakness. "You'll see." The rest of the meal passed in uneasy fragments. Diane and Trevor tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, talking about vacation plans and business ideas, but the air had shifted. Amy leaned against my arm, Samuel whispered about the barn fort, and Evan gave the faintest nod in my direction. They thought they were celebrating their victory. What they didn't know was that the feast in front of them was nothing more than the last supper of their illusion. 2 weeks later, the courtroom smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of place where truth and lies had been colliding for 100 years. I sat at the front with Evan by my side, his laptop bag at his feet, his face calm and unreadable. Across the aisle, Diane and Trevor whispered frantically to their lawyer, their polished clothes doing nothing to hide the panic creeping into their eyes. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled tight, shuffled the papers before her. "This case concerns the contested transfer of farmland belonging to Mr. Harold Whitmore," she began. "Allegations have been made regarding fraudulent signatures and improper notarization. Let us proceed." Trevor leaned back in his chair, trying to look relaxed. Diane kept her gaze down, fingers twisting in her lap. They still believed they could talk their way out of this. Their lawyer spoke first, painting them as caring children merely securing their father's future. He used words like practical and responsible, and at one point even called me confused by age. Diane nodded along, her lips pressed into a thin line. When it was our turn, I stood slowly, every joint protesting. I could feel the weight of generations pressing down on me, but I stood tall. My voice, though rough with age, carried across the room. "This land has been in my family since 1928, I said. My father worked it. My brother worked it. I've spent my life tending it. It is not a bargaining chip. It is our blood, our history. And no one, not even my own daughter, has the right to steal it." Evan stepped forward then, placing a folder on the clerk's desk. Inside were side-by-side comparisons of signatures, bank records, and the notary's history. He explained how the notary's license had been revoked 3 years prior, how the stamp used on the deed was illegally replicated, how Trevor had accessed a local print shop to forge documents. His words were sharp, confident, undeniable. Diane's face drained of color. Trevor shifted in his seat, his charm cracking into sweat. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Do you have anything to say in response?" she asked them. Trevor opened his mouth, but I beat him to it. I reached into my jacket and pulled out one final envelope. "Yes, Your Honor. This is my updated will, signed and notarized properly. Every acre, every dollar, every heirloom is left to my grandchildren." Diane and Trevor received nothing. The gasp from the gallery was audible. Diane finally looked at me, her eyes wide, pleading. "Dad, you can't." But I cut her off, my voice steady. "I already did." The judge reviewed the evidence, her gavel striking the block with a crack that echoed through the chamber. "The forged deed is void. Fraud charges will proceed. The property remains with Mr. Whitmore." Trevor slumped in his chair, his face twisted in fury. Diane covered her mouth with shaking hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. And I felt nothing but peace. When I walked out of that courthouse into the crisp Missouri air, Evan was beside me, the grandchildren waiting on the steps with wide smiles. Amy threw her arms around my waist, Samuel tugged at my hand, and for the first time in months, I felt the farm's soil calling me home again. Diane and Trevor thought they had buried me under their lies. Instead, they buried themselves. And I walked away, free, knowing my land, and my legacy, were safe where they belonged. A week after the trial, I woke to the sound of laughter drifting through the fields. Evan had brought Amy and Samuel out for the weekend. They were running through the rows of corn, their voices carrying on the breeze, chasing each other the same way Diane used to when she was their age. For a moment it was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing me back to simpler days, before ambition and greed had taken root. I stood by the old oak tree, the tree that still held the remains of the treehouse I'd built for Diane so many years ago. The boards were weathered now, but the memories clung to them like vines. I whispered into the quiet, "We did it, Eleanor. They won't take this from us." Evan walked up behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "It's safe now, Grandpa. You can rest." I nodded, my eyes stinging. Watching the children play, I realized the farm was more than just soil and crops. It was the heartbeat of our family. And though Diane had tried to sever it, her children would carry it forward. That night, we sat down to supper in the old kitchen. Roast chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, just the way Eleanor used to make it. Amy set her crayon drawing in the center of the table again, Grandpa's home. And for the first time in a long while, I felt whole. The land was safe. The legacy was unbroken. And though scars remained, I knew that love had outlasted betrayal. The Whitmore farm would endure, not because of deeds or signatures, but because it was rooted in something stronger. Family.
Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed listening to this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel to help support the creation of more stories like this. Have a great day or evening.